Hello and welcome to Unrecognised Heroes, the official podcast brought to you by the National Cyber and AI Awards. This is the podcast where we dive into the latest innovations, challenges, and success stories in the world of technology. I'm your host, Ellie, and today I'm joined by someone who's truly shaping the future of AI in a thoughtful and values-driven way. Sarah also sits on the National AI Awards advisory and judging panel. Welcome to the podcast, Sarah Schlobohm. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for spending the time to come on. I know we've spoken a little bit in the past around your background, but I'd love for you to set the scene for us, Sarah. So can you tell me a little bit about what sparked your interest in technology in the early days and, how it's led you to where you are now?
Yeah, gosh, I can't think of a time when I wasn't interested in technology. I grew up listening to, reading, watching a lot of sci-fi, and so a lot of these ideas, have sort of lived in my head for a long time in the likes of Star Trek and all sorts of things, and to sort of see more and more of these things come to life in real life is pretty amazing. I always liked science subjects in school. I always loved going to museums and things like that, but being able to actually work on some of the things that are shaping the future is really exciting.
It definitely does sound exciting. And although you've been interested in tech your whole life, it sounds like, can you delve into a little bit? How did your career in tech start? And again, kind of that journey of where it's led you to present day.
It's a good question. I'm wondering how far back I actually really have to think about that.
A big question.
It is a big question. I mean, I think it probably starts when you're thinking about what subject do you study at university.
Yeah.
I was interested in every subject in school. I was a huge nerd, no surprise there. But I had a math teacher send me to, I notice I say math because I'm originally American. Math for the British audience. Um, a math teacher who sent me to Women in Engineering Day at the local university, and it just really opened my eyes to the potential of careers in this field, in terms of what could happen long term. So I wound up studying physics at university and carrying that through to a PhD. Got well versed in a lot of programming and tech along the way as part of that. And it turns out that's really useful in business as well, even if you don't stay in academia. So once I finished my PhD, I joined a graduate scheme at PwC, which was a really good structured introduction to how business works, because I'd only ever studied academic subjects at university. I became a chartered accountant somewhat accidentally.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was that or get deported, so here we are. No, it's been fantastic. I learned so much, and I'm still really grateful to the ICAW and everything they do to support. And then yeah, after that I worked in financial services for many years. I worked in financial crime compliance at HSBC, so trying to stop people from using the bank for money laundering, terrorist financing, that kind of thing. And I've had several sort of senior leadership roles in AI recently over the last few years.
That's such a varied kind of career journey, but it's so linked if you think about it in many ways. But something we've talked about actually is your PhD in particle physics, which some people listening may think is worlds removed from AI, but well, let alone financial crime compliance as well, actually. But how did that transition come about? I know when you're telling the story, it's easy to kind of explain the journey, but how did that moment come for you where you thought, I'm going to take this and do something in AI with it?
Well, I mean, funny enough, that's where I first started using AI. People ask me how I pivoted, and it really wasn't a pivot. I didn't at the time realize it was anything special. I used to joke that, like, the PhD in particle physics should probably come with like a free bachelor's in computer science because there was so much programming. I go back as far as Fortran. My PhD was in C++. So I was working at Fermilab, Fermi National Accelerator Laboratory in the US outside of Chicago. And it's this massive machine. It collides particles and antiparticles at many, many nines close to the speed of light. And that creates a really complicated reaction. And it's in this huge detector that's like the size of a warehouse. And the only way you can sort of reconstruct what's happening is with advanced computing techniques. And so that's where worked on my first neural net. That's where I first started using random forests and all of these things that are bread and butter to AI today. I didn't realize they were so special. I didn't realize they were so cutting edge. It's just like, right, come to work. Here's your computer. Here's your badge. Here's your neural network. But it was really exciting at the time, and it's proved useful.
That's kind of answered my next question, really, which was, are there any parallels you see between the kind of physics side of things and then carried over into AI? But are there any skills or ways of thinking that you think you might have also carried over?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just the problem solving, the trying to, ask the right question. That's the most important place to start. Don't be a I always say don't be a solution looking for a problem. You want to know what are you actually trying to solve, and then what's the most pragmatic way to get there. Yes, the AI tools are fun, but at the end of the day, like they're tools and they're there for a purpose. They're there to solve a problem. They don't use a chainsaw to butter your toast. It's like
Yeah.
it's use the right tool for the job, and sometimes that's fun and exciting along the way. But I think there's a level of real pragmatism that came along. I think particle physics in particular is incredibly collaborative. It's these huge collaborations of hundreds of people across the world. So I was comfortable working remotely well before the pandemic came along, working with people from different cultures, having to get up and do big presentations. Some of that was really valuable. Doing public outreach was incredibly valuable. This ability to have to sort of say, okay, let's take this really cool technical concept and translate that to people who are interested and clever but don't have that technical background. That's been a really valuable skill too.
I imagine because you've worked with AI and on AI way before it became popular to the public in the last few years, it's almost a buzzword now. But how have you seen that development with the public kind of integrating AI into their daily lives? Have you found it quite interesting to watch, knowing the ins and outs of it from behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's been an interesting transition. So for the longest time, yes, data and analytics and machine learning, that was valued by businesses, but it was kind of like, you sat in the corner of the basement with the rest of the IT crowd. Like you were very much a sort of niche specialist technical skill. And obviously since ChatGPT came out, that would, that's the big spark of it. AI is just being spoken about at every level of the business, all the way up to the board level by absolutely everyone. And that's been the biggest change to see.
You touched on the right tools for the job, which is so interesting in the sense of there's so many tools out there. But have you got a particular tool that you like using? Do you have a preference? I'm just curious because you probably worked with so many.
Yeah, I mean it depends on what you're doing. I think fundamentally the tools come and go. What's really important is thinking about the principles. I mean, I still use Excel a lot. It's
Solid tool.
it's hitting its 40-year anniversary, I think, something like that. And it's yeah, it's about the right. I mean, I guess if I think about what AI specifically do I use the most, I suppose spend an awful lot of time arguing with ChatGPT. Just because I think not that it's necessarily better, but I think you sort of start to the more you use a tool, the more you sort of get to know how to make it work well, and you sort of get to know its voice and how to prompt it and how to say no, do this, not that, and that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, there are so many interesting things out there.
I know that we've spoken briefly before around the risks of bias in AI as well, and particularly around the impact perhaps on women and underrepresented groups. What are some of the kind of real world consequences of bias systems that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much out there. It can have a huge impact on people's lives. I mean, if you're talking about a bank, for example, you can talk about someone's access to credit, somebody's ability to buy a home or not, or to buy a car that allows them to get to work, all sorts of things. There's a really fantastic book called Invisible Women that talks
Okay.
about the data that goes into a lot of these models. Really, it's the data, right? The algorithms, they're just statistics. They're just fancy fast statistics at the end of the day. But if you feed it the incorrect information, it's going to learn from the bias that we feed it. And if we as a biased society give it stuff, it's gonna pick up that bias. So things like if you're thinking about medical applications, if those medical studies that you're feeding it haven't been tested on women, and a lot of them haven't, a lot of even the lab studies haven't been tested on female rats. They specifically exclude female rats from the study, which is wild. Then that information, if you go into the doctor and they're using an AI to try and, be a co-pilot to help diagnose you, women's symptoms of heart attack are very different from a man's. And so if that's not accounted for in the machine, it's only ever going to give you back what you fed it in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite stark, really, when you hear it in that way, and there's a very specific example as well of how we would all use it, I suppose, in day-to-day lives or be affected by it. Does it have any impact, I suppose, in shaping the work that you've seen or that you've done, Sarah? Have you ever come across bias in that way when you're kind of doing your day-to-day roles?
We try very hard not to. Every place I've worked, I've certainly tried to lead the charge for making sure that we have ethical AI, and we have that as much as possible we're trying to account for bias. I think one of the things that often pops up that people might not realize is postcode.
Okay.
So back in the day, back in the sort of early 20th century, there was a really unethical practice. It didn't involve AI at all, but it was called redlining. And
Right.
people would take a map of a city and they would draw a red line around an area and say, if people live here, don't give them a mortgage. And what that was correlated with was race. So that address corresponded to a neighborhood of a city that they didn't want to rent to those people. So unfortunately, many of those historic biases still exist in the way our cities are laid out, in the way everywhere we live is laid out. And so sometimes you have to be really careful if you're including postcode in something, because that can be a proxy for something else, whether you intend it or not. It can be a bias for race, for class, lots of different things.
And that's so kind of vital when you're during your hiring process, as I imagine, because someone like yourself has seen and experienced that. But Joe Blogs coming in with very little experience and understanding of elements like that may not even consider those aspects at all. And I think that's incredibly shocking, actually. But the truth, that's what we're living and seeing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's obviously a huge trend towards using AI in recruitment, and I can understand why people want to. The volume of CVs you get for any given role is massive, but it is high risk under the EU AI Act for good reason. Because if you have a historic bias in your hiring process, which many businesses do, particularly in tech, that can creep into the models. And the video ones can not perform particularly well for neurodivergent people.
Yes.
That's a worry. But in tech roles, yeah, one of the big, I used to teach an AI ethics course, and we would talk about some of the AI fails. That's always a good way to get people engaged. Like, let's look at an absolute train wreck of something that people tried to deploy. And one of the ones that we talked about was one of the sort of early machine learning techniques to screen for CVs for tech roles. And it absolutely picked up the bias to the level of it was looking for things like president of women's chess club, which would normally be a great thing. You've had a leadership position in an extracurricular activity, and discounting because that meant you were a woman and therefore less likely to be hired for a tech role.
It makes you quite angry listening to the examples. That I guess in your position, when it comes to building better models and influencing models being built from that inception, ones that genuinely reflect the full population as well. How do you approach that in practice, or what advice would you give to companies that are in that phase of innovation to be inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, be aware of it. Just there's some really really prominent examples out there, and just knowing that that can happen, having a bit of a checklist as part of your sort of model governance to say, do you know what, we're going to stop and check for bias. We're going to see who's represented in our data. We're going to ask ourselves proactively, is there any potential bias here? Is there anything we can do? Do we need this feature that's potentially biased? Maybe you do, right? Maybe it is important. Maybe it is important to have, age in a model for some financial score. But on the other hand, a really simple thing that you can do is just like build the model with and without that feature and see if you actually get a drop in
Yeah.
performance. And sometimes you don't. So if you don't need to expose yourself to bias in that way, if you can take some simple steps to try and check for it, there is some simple metrics you can do to say, hey, is what I'm seeing in my input population representative of the population I'm serving? By the time I sort of apply a score or process that information in another way, does that still look how I expect it to, or has something changed? Um, I think we are seeing greater regulation in the AI space. Some of it voluntary, like the likes of ISO 42001, some things less voluntary, like the EU AI Act, if you're dealing with anyone from the EU at all. Um, but it's in there for a reason. It's not there just to cause us more headache. It's to try and protect us from things we don't mean to do with these models. Most people don't mean to build a biased model. It creeps in
Yeah.
accidentally. Um, but you do have to take some effort to try and prevent it.
That was going to be my next question. Is it an intentional build in that way, or are companies quite receptive to actually, making change and recognizing that, like you say, to build two models, one with, one without the tool in, and checking if that makes any impact at all on the product?
I think it varies. I think most people wouldn't want to build a model and would be horrified if they found out they had built a model that was biased. Obviously, in any industry, you're going to come across some folks who are willing to act unethically. I've heard some horror stories, I won't say from
Yeah.
where, but like of ways that have targeted specific names because they thought they might represent certain ethnicities, and then try and target those people based on those ethnicities, which is pretty shocking.
Yeah.
um, but knowing that that happens means you can try not to do that.
When you think about it, and we kind of, like to think sometimes we live in this perfect world, but actually there's AI for good, and then there's the reckless side of it, isn't there, where people want to push the boundaries and see how far that they can really push things, which is frightening. But thinking more broadly, and around accessibility, I suppose, not just who's represented in data, but who can use and benefit from the AI tools. Where do you think the tech industry still has work to do?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do. I mean, I think there are some really amazing things that have happened in terms of inclusivity. I know that, like, I am much more likely to put alt text on a photo when I upload it online because I can just throw it into ChatGPT and say, give me the alt text on the photo. So, in some ways, here's an opportunity where it can improve accessibility. Um, in other ways, it's still a problem, and it's still a problem in some really silly ways. Like, for example, left-handed people. This is something that earlier this year, the PM of India actually highlighted at the AI summit in Paris, was that you still really can't get the common AI models to make an image of someone writing with their left hand. And I thought, there's no way that's true. So I went off and tried it myself. I tried a couple of different models. I thought, yeah, I'm really good at prompt engineering. I can do this. I couldn't. It was wild. It was absolutely wild. And that's just left-handedness. And that's 10% of the population.
When you
Um,
hear the analogy like that and unpack it a little bit more, I think that really clicks for some
mhm.
reason because it resonates, doesn't it, with everybody? When you hear it in that context, you're kind of like, well, there's still a lot of work to be done here.
Yeah. And that's just handedness, and that's not something anyone cares about anymore. Um,
Yeah.
in most places in Western society. So yeah, and it's a thing that's true across cultures, across time. As humans, we're roughly 10% left-handed, and yet our super modern technology has gotten better at, putting the right number of fingers on our hands,
Yeah.
but it still can't get us to use our left hands properly.
Gosh, that's so interesting. I'd like to dive into a little bit of kind of your career. I know we touched on it earlier in the episode, but you've worked across big corporates, you've worked across early stage startups, and I know I mentioned as well you're part of our advisory board for the National AI Awards. But what draws you personally, Sarah, to those kinds of roles? What do you look for when you're looking to get, hired in a certain company or be involved in certain projects? Is there kind of a checklist that you have that, these things must be hit for me to be involved, or how do you frame those in your mind?
but it's clearly not a specific industry. I think I'm just really drawn to solving interesting problems. If I didn't have the AI skills, I think I'd still want to solve problems in some way. So, is there an interesting problem to solve? Can I have a big impact? Can I, improve people's lives in some way if I get this right? Obviously, are they going to pay me a decent wage for it?
Yeah,
Can't
there is
ignore that aspect of it.
the good
But
old UK cost of living.
yeah, but I think yeah, just the challenge and the interesting problem and the common thread through my career has been this sort of data and data analysis and AI and machine learning, just pointing that at different problems. Data's data at the end of the day, and yes, it's super important to understand that domain expertise, but you can also speak to those domain experts and combine that with the AI, and that's when you're going to get the best model.
Yeah, and you mentioned there obviously about the data, and in my head, as a not kind of techie expert in AI, I imagine it's quite quantitative, and the problems we're talking about are quite societal, which
Mm.
leads me to think it's more of a, anecdotal, it's qualitative. Do you have those problems to solve in terms of, when you're looking at ethical AI projects and you're thinking about them? Is it kind of a head over heart situation, or do you purely work off the data that you've got in front of you?
No, I mean, you can build the best tool in the world, but if people don't adopt it, you haven't succeeded. So at the end of the day, you have to remember that it's people who are going to use this. If you're talking about AI adoption in a business, you have to win the hearts and minds. You have to convince people that like, yes, I'm automating part of your job away, but like by the way, it's that part you don't like. It's that part that you do on autopilot and say, why do I have to fill out this report again? Um, I hope that's the direction we're applying a lot of the AI that we're using in. Um, yeah, I think people are always at the heart of um, how we use AI. The reason ChatGPT was so successful wasn't so much a huge change in the underlying technology. That model, that GPT model that powers it in the background, had existed for several years, but you needed really quite technical skills to be able to access it in most situations. The thing that made it so successful, like the most successful product launch in history by like any measure, um, was that like they put a nice user interface on it and made it free.
Yeah.
And that's really the thing that's sort of kicked off this AI revolution. So yeah, you can't ever underestimate the human element.
It's quite fascinating, isn't it, when you hear these kind of, like you say, those groundbreaking launches, and it kind of changes and shapes the way society adopts to things like AI. Um, and with it rapidly evolving at such a pace that, AI is into people's lives and companies and the way that we live generally, the way that companies hire and build teams, I guess, is also shifting. So, from your perspective and your experience, what should employers be thinking about today when they're hiring for tech or AI roles?
Yeah, I mean, you hear stories of silly interviewing like you must have 5+ years experience with ChatGPT or whatever. Like it hasn't been out that long. That's literally not possible. But um, I think it's the recognition that these things are changing, and so you want people who are adaptable, who are willing to learn, willing to put in the effort, willing to say, yeah, I can tackle that problem, and here's how. Being able to ask the right question, being able to just figure it out and get it done. Because we're talking about some really new stuff, right? And it's a cool point in time where you might be the first person doing this thing.
Yeah.
That's so exciting, right? Like you might be the first person to implement this particular tool in this way and come up with some clever way to do it that then, suddenly makes the rounds and is the next rag or whatever. That's so exciting. Um,
That
Sorry, I forgot
must
the original
lead.
question.
No, no, that's completely spot on. I guess that's quite a motivating factor as well to work in AI. But something I think I've touched on actually with somebody on the podcast before is around the regulation of, I suppose, job titles and the way that things are hired in AI, because there's not so much regulation around that. So, when you're in that hiring process, how do you know if somebody is qualified and competent to do the roles that you're hiring for or needing those skills for?
Yeah, it's really tricky. The no, there's absolutely no standard in in job titles at all. I wouldn't rely too much on them. And especially because if you think about the sort of scale, a job title in a huge global megacorp means something very different from the exact same title in a startup. Um, so yeah, I wouldn't rely on that. I mean, I think when I look at a CV, I really like to see a CV that focuses on accomplishments. So what did they do in your previous roles? What did they achieve? Can you tell me how what you did when you turned up day to day made a difference to the business at the end of the day? What made you better at that job than a random person off the street? I think that's something I really love to see. And the technical skills, yeah, there are some sort of bare minimum. You sort of expect everybody's got to have decent Python or whatever. But those skills will change, and those skills can be taught. So you need to hire the right person who has that sort of spark of creativity, of innovation. I think if you're specifically looking at the AI space right now, but also grounded with a level of pragmatism.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that. That's a great kind of little toolkit for people that may not even know what they're hiring for. They know they need somebody to help them with their AI adoption, perhaps, but have no idea kind of where to start with it. So I think that's a really good little takeaway for anybody in the audience. In terms of, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, and it is so important, I think, to be a little bit open-minded. Like, yes, you can sort of write down and say, okay, this is the absolute ideal candidate. This is the person I want to hire. I want them to do this, this, that, and the other thing. But sometimes that candidate that is a bit unusual, that doesn't have that, solid trajectory career, who's just like, why did you put this on your CV? This is the strangest thing. Some of those have been my best hires. So, uh,
And that's really nice, kind of going back to what we were saying earlier, the AI tools to screen CVs. Sometimes you get the substance, but you're not really getting the person that you're
mm.
you're hiring, are you? You're getting all the boxes ticked perhaps, but like you say, those really interesting little nuggets that you see on CVs that make you think, why have you put that there? Or what does that mean? Or how
Yeah.
did you do that?
This
You're just
this
natural
person
curiosity.
won a silver medal in the Commonwealth Games.
Yeah.
What? That's so cool. You're not going to screen for that in AI tool. So yeah, it's
Yeah, exactly. I like that. I like that very much. I always like to close episodes on this podcast, Sarah, as you might already know, with a little bit of fun. And I always kind of ask our guests if you could have one superpower to kind of help you change something in the industry you work in or in the work that you do, what would it be and why?
I think I'd just like to read minds. It would make my job a lot easier. Just who's sitting there saying, I'm absolutely never going to use this in their heads, or who's saying, you know, gosh, I really need a break in this meeting. Or I think
Yeah.
it's just the ability to, yeah, get under the surface a little bit and understand what people are thinking, and what they're not saying. Uh,
Yeah, I
um,
like that. That's a good one. I think a lot of us would like that superpower. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I know the audience will probably enjoy this as much as I've enjoyed recording it with you. I think we've delved into a lot of different topics that I'm sure there'll be some comments wanting to find out more and people to connect with you. You're incredibly interesting. And I think it's also worth a thank you for all the work that you're doing to, support the National AI Awards and our advisory board and really kind of propelling things forward. So I wanted to just give you a little shout out there and say thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been so interesting reviewing the applications and seeing all the amazing creativity and all the different industries that people have applied AI in recently. I think, it's a really good time for these awards to be here and be present and be rewarding innovation across the country.
Thank you. Well, best of luck with everything that you've got ahead. I'm sure that we'll be hearing lots more from you in the future. And if you have enjoyed this episode as part of our audience, then please do head over to our LinkedIn, like, subscribe to be in the know of when our next episode is dropping.